Hey crew, Coach Josh here with GarageGangGyms.com, and today we're doing a deep dive into the world of deadlifting. Now before I go any further, this video is time-stamped. So if you scroll down to the description of this video, you will see each section of this workout is labeled for you so that you know, hey, I want to work on assigning tension, or my brace, or what is my back doing. You can just jump right there, especially if this is the second time you're seeing this video. Okay, so the deadlift. Before we jump into some of the coaching cues and I teach you how to do this, there's a few things that you need to understand first. And the first thing is, what are we working? So the answer is everything, but we're trying to emphasize our lower back, our glutes, and our hamstrings, and not any one more than the other. In fact, we want to try to use all three of those groups of muscles pretty much the same. That's actually our first tip with this video is as you're deadlifting in between sets, think to yourself, where do I feel it after I've put the bar down? If it's only in your hamstrings, only in your lower back, only in your glutes, you might need to clean some things up, okay? But yes, we're working grip, upper back, mid back, your quads, some, your core, absolutely, all of that's going on at the same time. But again, it's a primary movement for your posterior chain, lower back, glutes, hamstrings. So in this video, we're gonna cover your stance, starting positions, how to assign tension into the bar and in through your body, what to expect, especially as we're rounding the knee, what to expect at lockout, how to work on some of those things if you struggle off the floor, if you struggle getting around the knee, if you struggle at lockout, and ways to modify this exercise for when you're first learning, or maybe you're coming back from an injury or deadlifts seem just a little bit scary at first. So all of that's going to be covered. Again, those are going to be in the timestamps down below. So let's get into it. Okay, so the way I like to teach the deadlift is actually using the RDL first, because what we want to do is make sure you understand where we're trying to assign tension. This is also going to really help us with maintaining a good back position, and it's going to allow us to make this range of motion just a little bit less. The weight's going to be down a little bit, and from there, we're able to build into picking it up off of the floor. So the way we're going to do these RDLs is not only to warm us up to get us ready for these deadlifts, which is always a good idea, but again, to really emphasize what you should be feeling when we're doing a deadlift. At least this very conservative style of deadlift I'm going to teach you. Are there ways that you can contort your body so you can lift more weight? Absolutely. But that's not a great place to start, right? We want to start with strengthening your body, strengthening good positions first. And then from there, if you become competitive or something like that, we can certainly make some tweaks, maybe kick your hips up a little higher, whatever, so that you can lift more weight. We're teaching you how to deadlift so that you can do it in a progressive fashion. You're less likely to get hurt, and you're going to really feel your whole body working to do this. Okay, so let's talk that RDL. So what I want you guys to focus on first is what's going on from the hips down. Now, if you guys struggle with this RDL portion a little bit, no problem. I have a deep dive video on the RDL that just came out. Please go down into the description. You will see a link to that video down below. Watch that if this is complicated for you. But we're going to use the lessons that we learned in that video and apply it to a heavier movement, the full deadlift. So with my RDLs, before I even touch the bar, what we want to think about is how do I get my hamstrings and my glutes to have a little bit of tension in them when I bend over and when I stand up. So a really easy way to think about this is imagine you have your foot on the floor and you're trying to hook your heels behind you. So I'm grabbing the ground, pulling the floor behind me essentially. What that's going to do is if I actively pull the floor behind me, that's going to turn on my hamstrings and that's going to get my glutes a little bit tight. Now we want to go into this tension. So what I mean by that is thinking about hooking the floor the whole time. As I tip over, you're going to feel a lot of tension in your hamstrings and some in your glutes as we bend over. So I'm hooking the floor. I'm going to have a soft bend in my knees. That actually helps me feel my hamstrings even better. Then from here, as I hook my feet into the floor, I'm going to bend over at the hip, allowing my knees to travel back slightly, and I still am feeling this stretch in my hamstrings. This is going to help keep my lower back nice and flat as I tip over. Now, the reason I also like to warm up with RDLs is because for most people, the hardest part of the deadlift is actually getting around the knee. So we're already starting our day off with getting that position comfortable so that it's one less thing we have to worry about and it's something we can actually strengthen. So I'm going to hook my feet into the floor. I'm going to bend over, pushing my knees back slightly, still hooking my feet, and I'm only going to come to about here, and then I'm going to come right back up by pushing against the floor. So I'm hooking my feet, going to bend over, and then I'm going to push against the floor. So when I'm in that position, I keep saying push against the floor. I'm actually thinking about doing this, pushing down as aggressively as I can. Now, if all you concern yourself with in the deadlift is pushing against the ground, you're going to get 60% of this figured out. There's something going on in your upper body that we'll talk about, but once we get the bar from the floor to this position, our hamstrings will be on, we have that good hooking into the floor. Then if we're pushing against the floor, that's going to take care of most of what we need with our lower body. There's certain mechanics in your upper body and fully erecting yourself, but again, that's 60% of it already. So spend some time here. So I'm going to hook my heels, going to feel a good stretch. I'm going to push against the floor and come back up. Now, what we can already start talking about is the position of my shoulders. So if I turn slightly so you see me from a perfectly side angle, what I'm trying to do is as I am going into this RDL, and when I'm actually doing my deadlifts as well, is I'm going to keep my shoulder out in front of this bar as much as I can without going crazy about it. So it's just in front of this bar, and then as I stand up, notice I'm going to keep my shoulders pretty much right on top of this bar as I drive my legs into the ground. It's only at the very last moment that my shoulders are actually going to come behind it. Okay, that's going to make sure that my hamstrings and glutes and my legs stay engaged in this the whole time. Oftentimes people, they'll feel their lower backs a ton because they start to ramp or they really lead with their chest. And this is an act of just your lower back moving this bar. Okay, we want to make sure that we're pushing and staying over that bar the best we can. Okay, so do that 2 sets of 8 perhaps, and then let's throw some weight on the bar, and then let's talk about the actual full deadlift next. Okay, so again, if you were struggling with the RDL, please stop, go to the RDL video. It's so in depth, you will figure it out with that video. But again, we talked about the RDL not only to get you primed, but so that we can use the RDL to get us set up for picking the bar up off the floor. It also helps people who haven't seen that video, maybe don't have time to see it right now, to at least get started so that we can move on into picking it up off the floor. So again, the RDL video, we talk more about stance and things like that as well, which we're about to cover right now. Go see that video if you need to. So stance. Honestly, so many people put a lot of emphasis on where do my feet go width-wise. What I'm going to tell you is I want your feet to go wherever it's comfortable. Some people are super flexible. They can either put their feet in really close. Some people go really wide because they have longer torsos. For you, all I'm looking for is it's going to be somewhere between your armpits, your hips, maybe your shoulder width and your hips, somewhere in that ballpark. Now, when it comes to how close to the bar am I going to be? The way I like to teach a deadlift is I want you pushing the bar off the floor the first 3 to 4 inches. Then from there, it turns into a pull. So we actually use our quadriceps off the floor. We use our hamstrings, glutes, and lower back once it's broken from the floor. This is more similar to what you would expect in the Olympic weightlifting with a clean. Maybe not so much what you'd expect at the highest levels of powerlifting. But anyway, so what I'm going to have you do is when you look down at your feet, I want that bar to cover this final lace of your shoe. So if I look straight down, it's going to cover that final lace of my shoe. Now, why do we do that? Number one, it's going to allow us a little bit of space when we squat down to the bar. So that's essentially what I'm going to do, is I'm going to squat down to this bar. And in doing so, as I squat down to this bar, I'm going to bring my shins to the bar. Okay, some people have a tendency, they start the bar way out, they'll roll the bar back into them, and then they'll stand up. We'll cover this more with what's the difference between a static and a dynamic stretch, or a dynamic start, which is coming soon. But the reason I don't like that is because you're starting from an unbalanced position. So again, I want you to be able to squat down, your shins touch this bar, and you can hold this position long term. It'll burn, of course, but that's what we want. We want our feet flat, our legs engaged. Now let's talk about the RDL and how it applies to this barbell. So I know that if I were to squat down, my shins will touch the bar. we're in a good place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place my hands on my legs as if it's a barbell and as if I'm going to do an RDL. The reason being, we're starting to teach you on the way down before we pick up the bar exactly what we want our bodies to do in reverse order. So I'm at a nice erect position here. I'm going to hook the floor like we talked about with the RDL, so I feel my hamstrings. I'm going to bend in my knees slightly. I'm going to do my RDL, sliding my hands down my legs as I do this. Okay, once I get to almost my maximal stretch, so this is my maximal stretch, a little bit less than that. From here, I'm going to try to maintain this tension. I'm going to squat down to this bar, and I'm going to place my hands on the bar. Now, I'm keeping a fairly straight back. I'm still hooking the floor, so I feel my hamstrings just a little bit, because again, my quads are actually going to help me lift this bar off the ground initially. And as I lift, we'll talk about this in a second, my body's going to move a little bit so that I can leverage my hamstrings. But I did my RDL, I've squatted down, and before I even do anything, I want you to notice that my elbows and my knees line up pretty close. If I had longer legs, my hips might be a little higher. If I had smaller legs, my hips might be a little bit lower. But for most people, lining it up here is a great place to start. Now, your start, or what we would say is the difference between a static and a dynamic start. Static start is how I want most of you to learn how to deadlift. A static start is you get extremely tight, you take your breath, you build tension, and then once you've built that tension, then you lift the bar. Other people, and you'll see me doing this later on in this video, will do what's called a dynamic start, where they use their body, they move their body in order to help them get that bar off the floor, get a little speed on it, and then from there lift. That's where the rolling thing happens with people. With weightlifters, they usually start with their hips high, drop them down. But learning, I want you to be static. I want this to be uncomfortable. I want you to feel your quads, your core, your back before you even lift this bar. Because if you aren't feeling something and you go to pull this bar off the ground, who knows where you're gonna be assigning tension, okay? And again, we want to assign that tension into our entire body as much as we can. If we just yank this off the ground because we're trying to do a dynamic start and lift more weight, chances are you're not going to be assigning it where you want to be assigning it. So what we want to emphasize when pulling the bar off the floor is setting a consistent back angle. So with these static starts that we're going to be talking about, we need to make sure that we get set into a certain position, and then when the bar lifts off the floor, we keep our spine at that certain angle. The tendency is for your hips to kick up, for your shoulders to come back. Both tell me you're not doing what you need to do with tension, with your legs, with your core, okay? So again, our goal, and you should video yourself from the side, is as you lift that bar, that those first couple inches, your upper body isn't moving, just the bar is moving from the floor. Again, a huge fault is first thing to move is your shoulders because you're trying to get it around your knees for some reason, or, and this happens to a lot of people who try to yank it off the ground, first thing to move is their lower back, right? Their hips come up and then they kind of come up this way. They're all considered deadlifts, right? But not as efficient as if you can use your entire body and really leverage your body into the floor and help you lift that bar. Okay, so again, I hook the ground, I RDL, I get to my near maximal stretch, I'm gonna squat down, hands go on the bar. Now, I'm gonna dramatize this for you. My elbows are very bent, I'm very rounded. This means I don't have a whole lot of tension in my body. So what I wanna do is I'm gonna take a big breath, and to keep it as simple as possible at first, and we'll get into some more nitty-gritty stuff, to keep it as simple at first, we're gonna hold our breath. I'm going to try to stretch my arms as far as I can, and then I'm gonna lift my chin before I actually lift this bar. So I'm gonna take a breath, I'm gonna try to stretch my arms as far as I can, lift my chin, and then I'll lift the bar. What this is gonna do, and you're gonna feel this, you're building tension into your entire body. It gets really uncomfortable in your quads if you're doing it right. It's really uncomfortable in your glutes if you're doing it right. All your body wants to do is stand up, okay? But before we actually pull this bar from the floor, let's talk again with what we're doing with our legs. So if we go back to what we were talking about quickly with the RDL, we push against the ground, right? That's how we're going to break this bar off the floor, is I'm going to get extremely tight. I'm going to be in my position. See if I can hold my balance for you guys. I'm going to be extremely tight, hold my position. I'm going to take that breath. I'm going to stretch my arms. I'm going to lift my chin, and then I initiate the deadlift with this, pushing down into the floor. So again, I RDL into position. I squat down to the bar. My hands are on the bar. I stretch my arms as much as I can, lift my chin, and push my feet into the ground. Okay, so let's get that far first. RDL, I feel my hamstrings. I squat. I breathe. I stretch, lift my chin, push. Okay, now, at first, you're going to break it from the ground, great, and it's going to do something. You're going to stand up, it's going to feel weird, and it's going to feel awkward, because we're not that far yet, right? But I do want you to stand up with it every time. Stopping midway is a great way to assign tension into your lower back. And not that that's a bad thing. It can actually be a great thing if you're training to strengthen your back in certain positions. But when you're first learning, it can be a little intimidating because, oh, I start to feel my lower back. I'm kind of scared. Your lower back does a job, but hopefully you're feeling your hamstrings. Hopefully you're feeling your quads and your core. Let's step that a little bit more. So a little bit more advanced. Once you figured that initial part, great. Maybe you came back to this video a few weeks later, a few workouts later, a few sets later. Now let's talk a little bit more about what's going on. What I'm trying to do is the stretching the arm cue is great for starters. The lifting your chin cue is great for starters. But to advance that, what I'm actually doing is I'm taking my arms and I'm trying to push my arms down and back as I lift my chest up. So my arms are straight. I push, pull, whatever you want to call it, my arms down and back as I lift my chest up, and that's where the chin cue is. Now, the reason I emphasize stretching your arms is because people, when they first try to brace in their lats, they'll actually be kind of soft because they're using their arms too much. So a way I like to think about it is imagine you're trying to, I'll just show you. Imagine as you're doing that drawing back, you're also trying to lift your shoulders up and away. Some people like the cue of lifting their chest up. Either way, I want separation from your shoulder and the bar as much as possible, that distance. It'll stretch your arms. Tendency, though, is when you're first learning is to lean back, okay? You get a stretch in your arms, but you're sitting back too far into your heels, and it makes it uncomfortable. It's similar to that rolling start. So again, as I pull this back and I lift up, I still need to keep my shoulder directly on top of that bar or slightly in front of. So it'll look more like this. So I RDL into position. I squat down. I take my breath. I pull the bar back toward me, stretching my arms. Chin is up. Take my breath. Pull back, stretch, chin, then I can push. Keeping my shoulders over the bar the whole time. Okay, that's a static start. Now, if you really want to get static with it, and when people are brand new to deadlifting, it'll look more like this. There'll be a pause before they actually lift it. Now, before we continue on with dynamic starts and things like that, if you're struggling to feel your legs off of the floor, a cue that really works for my clients is to imagine you're going to lift that bar using your legs 1/8 of an inch, and then once you've lifted it that 1/8 of an inch, then you're going to lift it the other couple feet, okay? The reason I say that is if you get that bar floating just a little bit off the ground, you will know where and where not you feel tension, okay? So I'll show you that. Bar is just going to barely float. For some people, that's actually a great training tactic, that halt deadlift, where you lift it a little and you halt. Again, for some people who get a little sloppy off of the ground or use momentum a little too much, doing that little pause can be very beneficial. And again, if you're brand new, it'll tell you right now if it's in your lower back. You'll feel your feet. Are you too far forward? Are you too far back? Do you feel like you're losing your balance? Because the first 1/8 of an inch If it's off a little bit, that means as you're lifting, you need to be good enough and skilled enough to compensate your position and fix your position on the go. And if you're just learning, that's really hard to do. It's really hard to do even when you're not first learning. So again, lift it just a little bit. So now let's talk, we talked static, now let's talk dynamic starts. First, before I even cover this subject, yes, it will help you get the bar off the floor easier. But it's very important you guys spend months, if not years, practicing a static start. Very little movement at first. You know exactly where that position is that you want to pull from. The reason being, the dynamic start, we're going to bring our body away from that starting position in some way, shape, or form. We're going to bring ourselves in and through that starting position through our dynamic start. So if you don't know where that static start is to begin with, your dynamic start is going to be terrible and it's going to be all over the place. You're going to lose your balance. And if you lose your balance when deadlifting a really heavy weight, your risk of injury goes way up. So you need to be so good at static starting before you would do dynamic. And here's how I would approach implementing this dynamic start. So this has worked for my lady, Megan, I'm calling you out. She can deadlift 380 pounds and her dynamic start is very subtle. It's very small. But the pros of a dynamic start, especially the one I'm about to show you, is starting static, it really fatigues your legs. It really builds tension. There's a long time before you actually pull. Having a little bit of a dynamic start allows you to be a little soft and a little loose for a second right before you take a breath, right before you get tight and you roll through your start position. So here's what Megan does, and this works great for a lot of new people. So what she does is she gets tight, she stretches up on the bar. Then what she's going to do is she's going to relax her legs and bring her hips back, but she keeps tension in her arms. She's still pulling up and back on this bar, but it doesn't move. This is so she doesn't lose her balance. This will allow her to take a good breath. And then as she brings her shins forward, she's going to lift her chin and go through her deadlift. She's only adding a 2-inch dynamic start. She's keeping tension in her arms and her lats. And again, all she's doing is moving her legs and hips out of the way a little bit so they can not be under tension. Takes a breath, hits that bar with her shins, and stands up. But she always comes back to that static position, and as should you. Now, I'm a little bit more wild with my dynamic start. What I mean by wild is I lift my hips really high. That way it takes all the load away, and all I'm feeling is a stretch in my arms. Then I take a big breath because it allows me, especially if I'm wearing a belt, to have my hips really high, take a good solid breath so I can be tight. And then as I bring my hips down, I get my chin up and then I can stand up. And this is what that looks like. I start here, I'm stretched. I take a breath. And again, what the dynamic start allows me to do is break the bar off the floor a little bit faster and a little bit easier. I struggle most on a deadlift with the first 3 to 6 inches off the floor. If I can pull it off the floor, those 6 inches, the deadlift's mine. So the dynamic start, the one I use, helps me get past my sticking point, okay? So again, static start, dynamic start. Another dynamic start is the rolling start. I don't really like that one because most of the time, as people roll, their hips come behind the bar, they sit really low, and then their first movement is their body coming forward. Okay, so let's dive into the pull from the floor just a little bit more advanced wise. What am I trying to do? So yes, I'm trying to push into the ground. That's absolutely true. But if all I do is just push against the floor, my knees are going to stay in exactly the same place like it would on a squat. We're not squatting with the bar below us, right? We're going to pull the bar into the locked out position. So yes, we are pushing, but we're also going to get ourselves into the correct position so that we can pull the bar to our lockout position. So what I mean by that is when I'm pushing through the floor, my knees are actually going to travel back because I'm thinking at some point, this is going to turn into an RDL. right about the time that that bar is getting under my knee joint here, right in my patella tendon, right here, right as it's about to round the knee, I want to be thinking this is an RDL. That's why I want you practicing doing an RDL into position. Because if you practice RDL into position, where the bar would be about here, you squat down, you drive up into that RDL position, great, now you know what to do. It's just an RDL at this point, and you stand up and finish your deadlift. So again, as I'm pushing into the ground and you're watching yourself and because you're videoing yourself, if you want me to critique your form, please send it to me, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, whatever. I will critique your form if you'd like. We want to see those knees travel back just a little bit. So be watching that now. So I'll start with my static start. Take a breath. I'm going to pull the bar back, chin up, knees, and then I stand all the way up. Okay, let's move on to the next step, getting around the knee, okay? So we got the bar from the floor to just below the knee, okay? Now we're gonna work on, for a lot of people, the hardest part, which is getting around the knee. So the tendency is as we're deadlifting, our arms just dangle. The weight's pulling on us and they just dangle there. And that's a normal thing. If you feel like, I feel like the bar is always, that's totally normal. What we wanna do though is improve on that. So as the bar comes up, we don't need to scrape our shins. And in fact, if you deadlift from a balanced position, chances are you'll only nick your shins a little bit, maybe just under your knee. The people that really grind their shins, they're typically the ones that roll the bar, drop their hips, and then they are in this big incline as they come up, and it's almost like the bar is falling into their shins as they grind it up then. We're not doing that, okay? The bar is really only going to make contact above the knee. So again, getting it from below to above the knee, that's really, really hard for people because what you're doing is you're stretching your hamstrings quite a bit. You're actually sending your knees back quite a bit. You're clearing the runway. And then you have to re-tense those hamstrings just a little bit so that your knees can kind of hold steady and then your torso can start to pivot and start to erect itself, right? So that's what happens around the knee is I'm going back. Then here my hamstrings hold me tight so that my hips can start to leverage and I can start to come up, at least through my hips. A lot of people, what they do is as it gets heavy, instead of using their hamstrings to help them erect their body, their hamstrings and glutes, they'll just start to use their lower back. And this is where a lot of people get stuck at the lockout, is getting around the knees. If as you're coming around the knees, you use your lower back to try to get you into this position, you have to ramp the bar, which is illegal in a lot of federations, and then your glutes are way back here, your lower back's on. You have to turn your lower back off to turn your glutes on. So if we have our hamstrings on, when we need to fire those hips forward towards the bar and meet them at the top, we can. So let's practice that. What I like to do is, as I'm doing lighter deadlifts, I'm still warming up, I'll just take it a little slower around the knee so that I can feel my hamstrings going from stretched to locking in tight so that I can pull my glutes through and then I can finish pressing into the ground and standing up. So here's what that'll look like. I take my breath, I'm gonna go slow. I'm gonna pull this bar back. Keeping my shoulders on the bar at all times. Now, as the weight gets heavier, that weight is gonna be pulling you forward a little bit more. You're not gonna be able to get it into you every single time so that when you stand up, it's just you locking your hips out. There are gonna be times it's slightly in front and you're fighting tooth and nail to pull your bar back towards you so that you don't have to bring your hips forward. Because where a lot of people get it wrong is if you bring your hips too far forward, your legs will unlock. And in most federations, if your knees are soft, they don't count that. And then doing this is illegal. So we need to make sure as we're coming around, our glutes are doing their job. We continue pushing through the ground so that when that bar is a little bit away, we can at least get it back into us as we finish our lockout. Okay, so a really good way to work on getting it around the knees is to actually start the bar right at that spot, right at the soft spot underneath your kneecap, maybe just a little bit lower. I'm using boxes here. A lot of gyms that you'll work at, they're gonna have a long arm or some type of a safety spotter arm, something like that. You can put this on there. This is called a rack pull. Now, again, a lot of people, they use rack pulls to overload that position. That's perfectly fine. We're going to use it to learn, okay? Oftentimes when people overload the rack pull, they get into a bad habit of leveraging their lower back, or rather than being in the same position they would be on a deadlift, they'll start more inclined where they would never be able to get to. And then they can do heavier weights like this, which there's some benefit to that. But for your actual deadlift, we want to keep it as close to the deadlift as we possibly can. So for my tall clients as well, I like to start them on the boxes too, because if you're 6'5", bending over and grabbing the bar from the floor at first when your hips are really stiff, you're not quite into this whole lifting thing, that can be really difficult. So again, raising it up a little bit, it allows us to really do kind of a static RDL again and again and again. And I like boxes because if anything goes wrong, you can just drop it at any time. So I'm going to look down. The bar is going to now be more over the tongue of my shoe, because if you imagine as I'm pulling it off the floor, or pushing it off the floor so I could pull it from there, when I get that bar to about the same position it's going to be with this setup, my shins are going to be pretty much straight up and down. They still might be slightly towards my toes a little bit, but they're pretty much going to be straight up and down, meaning that bar is going to be over the tongue of my shoe and not so much the last lace in my box like we talked about from the floor. So I'm going to look down. It's pretty much over the tongue of my shoe. It's actually over the knot of my laces right here. I'm going to squat down so that my shins are on the bar. If you're still practicing into your RDL position, that can be great. You bend, you're hooking the floor, you're tipped over, still can't quite reach the bar, drop down just a little bit. Same rules apply. So it's below my knee, I take my breath, I got to get my knees out of the way, and then I got to lock my hamstrings down so that I can finish with my quads and my glutes. Take a breath, push, lock, stand. One fluid motion. Okay, that's in my opinion, the best way to work on how to get around the knees. Because if you don't get your knees back far enough off the floor, your body weight's going to be forward. You're going to really have to use your lower back. If you have a tendency to put too much emphasis into your heels, it's going to be really hard because you're going to be so bent over, so out of balance, you're going to have to pull with your lower back. So again, this is a great way, especially if you're just learning. You could deadlift on a Monday and on a Thursday practice a position that you struggle at. But now let's talk about the lockout. We've kind of alluded to it already, but let's go there. We're going to use the same setup we were just using to work around the knee. Because if we're just struggling with the lockout or just learning the lockout, if we can take away that floor position, that saves our lower back quite a bit. Because our lower back actually works far more, at least the way I'm teaching you how to deadlift, off the floor than it does at the lockout. Now again, with our lockout, we need to make sure that after we've cleared the knee and we anchor our hamstrings, right? So I'm hooking the floor. From here, I gotta keep pushing down. I gotta bring my glutes forward. And by having this tension in my hamstrings, as I bring my glutes forward, that's naturally going to erect my back. I'm not trying to lift my chest up. What I'm doing is I'm just keeping my chin up. I push, and it naturally brings me up from here down. Your butt is a round muscle, at least your max. Your glute max is a round muscle. So what it can do is it can grab right under that fast region and at the top of your hip, and it can help bring you up, right? It's like that sipping water bird, okay? You don't need your lower back to actually stand upright. Our lower back is what's holding or helping us hold this weight. Our lower back doesn't need to hold the weight and try to move it at the same time. Our glutes, our hamstrings can move the weight. So again, we anchor. I'm still pushing. It keeps my shoulders on top of this bar for as long as I can. That bar is coming back toward me. My glutes continue squeezing together, and that allows me to come to a nice erect position, legs locked out, and my shoulders behind the bar. So many people, as they're coming up, because they use their lower back to stand up and they straighten their legs, in order to get hip lockout, they end up bringing their knees bent or their shoulders come way behind the bar. For some people, that's just because they're not patient and they're not trusting that their legs and glutes are strong enough to get them to this position, that they try to ramp, bring those hips through, and all they care about is getting that lockout position because for some reason that's all people care about. In most federations, you need to have your knees straight and your hips locked out. And the way we do that is we anchor those hips, we anchor those hamstrings, we push, our glutes bring our shoulders back, and all I do is just keep pushing. Okay? So let's watch that. I'll get around the knee, I'll pause, and then you can see what I have to do. I'm here, my hamstrings are hooked, my glutes anchor, I can breathe, I can push down through the ground, glutes are on, and there's no need to excessively come back here. In most federations, it's simply to get your shoulders behind the bar, and if I have locked legs and locked glutes, I naturally am going to come behind this bar, and if I arch away too far, what that's going to do is it's going to take my traps and bring them behind my hands, so it actually makes it a lot harder to hold on to in the long term. And that's why some people, as they're trying to lock out, they lose their grip, is because they're trying to bring their muscles, right, their grip muscles, which your forearm does a lot of it too, but your traps, your upper back, your mid back, they're coming way back here. That's really hard. That's a weird angle for your body to try to pull. When we're directly over it, now we can actually leverage all of the muscles in our upper back to hold on to that bar. Okay, let's take it to the floor again. Let's go through the whole motion and we'll dive even deeper. Okay, so before we continue on, let's talk about our grip. Josh, why don't you flip your hand when you deadlift? Why? I'm not a power lifter. I'm a weightlifter. So the difference is, in my sport, I use a hook grip. So I put my thumb under my first two fingers. And my hands are in the same plane. My palms are facing behind me in my sport. By flipping my hand, all that's going to do is make my body twist to one side, and that doesn't actually help my sport. So if I'm not using a hook grip, I will always use straps. And I highly recommend, if you're not a competitive powerlifter, you should consider getting some straps like these. So these straps are very specific. They're a single loop that your hand goes in, and it allows me to put the bar between the strap and loop it towards my thumb one time. I'm not a huge fan of the ones that go all around your wrist and they're a really long lasso and you can wrap it multiple times. The reason being, number one, that completely takes your hands out of the equation completely. But number two, it's very hard to be safe. It's not unsafe, but it's hard to be safe. Here's what I mean. Because you're wrapped in so tight, if something happens and you need to let go or bail, when you let go, you're still strapped in. That thing's pulling you down to the ground. When you're strapped in with these types of straps, these are weightlifting straps, and it's one time around towards the thumb, what it does is, instead of anchoring to your wrist, it's at the base of your hand, and it forces you to actually still train your grip even though you're using straps. It just saves your hands a little bit, and in my opinion, it doesn't help me any more than if I flip my hand anyway, but it keeps me in this position. If you're not a professional powerlifter, or competitive powerlifter rather, there's no need for you to twist your body, twist your spine to one side. For you, I would highly recommend being double overhand. If you want to do a hook grip where you put your thumb under these two fingers, that's totally fine. It can be pretty intense for people when they're first learning how to do it. But again, straps, pretty comfortable, not that challenging to do. Okay, so let's see this deadlift from the floor. So I'm going to RDL into position, hamstrings are on. I'm going to squat down, hands are going to be down. As I take my breath, I'm going to stretch my arms, pull the bar toward me, lift my chin, clear the runway, move my knees out of the way, lock my hamstrings down, continue pushing through the ground, and squeeze. Ready? My breath. Now with the dynamic start. And again. The deadlift. Now, let's talk more about what my lats are doing. Again, I'm not trying to grind my shins the whole time, but as I come up, a lot of people think about keeping the bar in a straight line. Technically, with where the bar starts, if the bar were to go in a perfectly straight line, it would be about 2 to 3 inches away from my legs at lockout, and then it'd have to fall into position. So a straight line on a deadlift isn't quite what we're doing. We want to favor that bar coming toward us. And the way we do it is much like the straight arm lat pull downs you've probably done before, is I'm pulling my arms down and back as I pick my chest up. And what that's going to do is it's going to turn my back muscles on, my lats especially, and that's going to help keep it close. So as soon as I clear that knee, I'm going to pull that bar back even harder so that I can, again, leverage my hamstrings, stand up, and squeeze by pushing down through the floor. So let's throw some weight on. Let's change the angle. Let's do some lifting, and I'll talk to you about it. Okay, same rules apply. It's really important as we get heavier in weights, we treat them exactly the same. And in fact, after I've done a few reps for you, I'm going to flash you to me pulling one of my heaviest weights ever. And I hope you see that the way I approach this weight and the way I approach that weight are exactly the same. And that's so important. If you're changing how you deadlift every single time you deadlift, your body can't quite get good at any one particular way of deadlifting. So it's really important, especially as you're first learning, to try to solidify the same consistency you possibly can. We approach the bar the same, we line up the same. If you're still doing RDLs, great, RDL, squat down, take your breath. And deadlift. So what am I thinking about? Everything exactly the same. Each time I deadlift, I might be thinking, today, I really want to work on how my hamstrings anchor so that I can stand up. Okay, great. Maybe some days as I'm working, I need to focus on pulling that bar back towards me. Maybe I tend to lose my balance and go towards my toes, so I need to make sure I stay anchored, right? That cue from the beginning of hook your foot into the floor so that you feel your hamstrings, that can really help anchor you. And that's also why we don't talk too much about feet, is if you understand how to engage your hamstrings, engage your quads correctly, then we don't have to worry about the tripod foot. What is my big toe doing, my little toe, my heels? If you are correctly hooking your feet into the floor so your hamstrings turn on, your hips are going to open up, your feet clutch the ground, everything's nice and tight, then you're not having to think about, am I doing something? All you have to think about is continuing to do something, right? A lot of the cues I like to give you guys is something that you can feel, not something you have to search if you do feel or don't feel, right? So when people are first learning how to deadlift, you shouldn't feel your lower back. So the whole time you're deadlifting, all you're doing is thinking about your lower back, thinking, is it on? No, it's not. Oh, it is. Nope, nope. When you're not thinking about pushing through the floor, doing things that you can control and actually feel. Same with feet. Not a huge fan of, oh, feel your pinky toes and your big toes and the heel of your foot. That's three things to focus on. On a deadlift, again, if we're imagining we're hooking that floor through our foot, that's going to pull us into a good position right over the middles of my feet. Because I feel my hamstrings, it's really easy for me to focus on. As I'm standing up, if I'm still feeling my hamstrings, my feet have to be grounded. Because if you feel this tension and let your foot collapse, you're going to lose all of that tension. But again, it's really easy to feel, did I lose that tension and how do I regain it? Hey, I lost tension in my hamstring, I regained it, good, it fixed my foot. Because the foot is the symptom, but the problem is the hamstring or the glute turning off, and that's what causes the feet to collapse. Focusing on the foot doesn't help us. Focusing on making sure the hamstring is doing its job and we're hooking that floor, it's going to keep those feet active, it's going to keep everything tight, and it's something we can actually feel. So let's add some more weight and keep lifting. Okay, so talking about jumps. So for the purposes of this video, I'm jumping 90 pounds at a time. It's not something that most people do or you have to do. But what you want to think about is jumping maybe 15 to 20% of your max every single time you jump. So if my max, say, is 100 pounds, I might only jump 15 to 20 pounds every single time. I might start with the bar, go to 65 maybe, go to 75, 85, somewhere in there, maybe 95 for my sets of 2. Great, cool. But for me, my deadlift is a little bit higher than that. So jumping 90 pounds is within that 15 to 20% range, and it's nothing too crazy. But as I get closer to that actual maximal weight, my jumps are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. In fact, the first time I deadlifted 500 pounds, I jumped 30 pounds to get to 500, which again, 20% of 500 is 100 pounds. I wasn't going to jump from 400 to 500 and let it rip. I wanted to make sure I got a few warm-up sets as I went. Now, the deadlift. It can be very, very fatiguing. So when we are choosing our weight, it's also important we think about consistency. So if every single time I go to deadlift 400 pounds, I'm going to take the same jump, 135, 225, 315, 365, boom, I'm going to hit 400. As long as that stays consistent and I consistently do 2 sets of 5 at the first weight and then a set of 4 at the next weight and keep the repetitions consistent, not only is that going to help kind of focus our brain in, but if we have an inconsistent warm-up, maybe your day of a 400-pound deadlift goes wrong because today you decided to do 315 for 6 when you normally only do it for 1 or 2. But also, when you're using your equipment, if you're using straps, pick a time, pick a weight when you start to use those straps. I wouldn't recommend using straps right away, but as you get closer to maybe 60 or 70% of the weight that you want to do that day, maybe you start putting those straps on just to get your head out of the game or head out of the way. If you're putting on a belt, I highly recommend, if you're getting into that 75 to 80% of your max weight, so again, let's say your best lift is 300 pounds. If you're past 240, 245 maybe, you start putting on that belt, because if you're planning on using it at 280 today, you want to get some practice in before you actually have that weight on the bar. Okay, so I'm only going to do this a couple times. Then I'll throw another 50 on, throw my belt on. We'll talk about the straps a little bit more, and then I will flash to a bigger lift, and then we'll critique my form on that bigger lift and talk about things that I could do better the next time I want to take a big crack. So same deal, just not going to talk as much because it is a little over 300 pounds. All right, let's jump up. A huge, huge thing is as we get heavier, you will have to put more force into the ground. You will have to try harder when lifting heavier. But this is when people are going to start thinking to themselves, I need to do something special. I need to yank it off the ground. It's really heavy. It starts to get into your head. You're intimidated, whatever, and you start changing your technique. The most important thing you can do is change nothing, okay? Just as you lift, you can build some speed into that deadlift. So what I mean by that is you're going to be hyped up when it's a big weight. Maybe you haven't touched it in a while. Maybe it's new. And the most important thing is to start the bar off the floor slowly, okay? We want to start it slow and accelerate it through to the top. If we start fast, then there's going to be a point in your lift, and this is what causes a lot of people to struggle with their lockout. There's going to be a point in your lift where the bar starts to slow down. And once that bar starts to slow down, it's really working against you, right? Gravity's really taking over. And again, if you go really fast to about here and then you slow down, oh, you're just grinding the whole time. But if we think to ourselves, we're going to start a little bit slower and speed up, then it gives us a little bit better of a shot to get into our stronger positions, which is about here, right as we're getting to our lockout, so we can anchor and stand up. Okay, so again, I'm going to treat this weight as if it's one of my other weights. I'm going to start a little slower, and then I'll add some speed to it as I get going. Maybe we'll do it for 2. Now, what I want you to take note of is the way in which I deadlifted that bar, and now see how I deadlift this next bar. And I'll do a voiceover and talk you through some of the finer points of this lift so that I can show you some of the faults that I may have. But what I want you to notice is how consistent my technique stays from the first weight you saw me lifting all the way to this next one.
So, like you saw me doing with the last weight, I put my belt on, I'm going to walk up to it, I'm going to strap, same time, the same tempo, I'm going to take my breath the same way, and I'm going to try to lift it the exact same way. So let's watch this. Belt on, I'm going to strap in, take a good breath, chin up, push, pull back, anchor, and stand. So let's talk about some of the good things that we see. So I hit my starting position. You can see initially off of the floor that there's a slight bend in this bar, right? Because I stretched my arms for the most part. I'm pulling that bar back toward me, right? Right when the bar breaks from the floor, there's a good amount of tension. That's what we're looking to see. Okay. Boom. Let's take it back. As I push the ground away, my shins become pretty vertical. As I'm standing up, I pull the bar back toward me. I anchor my hamstrings. I'm going to keep pushing, 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 glutes and arms and hips all at the same time. So let's see it one more time in full speed. Okay, so let's talk about what I can work on. So the main thing I can work on is as I'm doing this deadlift, there's a lot of play back and forth in my feet. The weight wants to pull me one way, my hips are trying to go another way. So what I can work on is more RDLs, more tempo work, especially around the knee. So you'll see as I come around the knee, there's a ton of pressure way back here in my heel when I want that pressure right under the tongue of my shoe, right? If you recall back to when we used the boxes, this bar was directly over the tongue of my shoe. Right now, it's kind of behind it. I'm a little bit more vertical, which means it kicks me over just a little bit further. My hamstrings are a little bit more stretched than I'd like to see. So it'd be a great benefit to me if I practice the bar maybe from about mid-shin, or when I lift the bar off the floor, if I paused at the mid-shin and then worked around my knee just a little bit more with significant weights, because this is, near a 1 rep max. But I do a great job of keeping my body and my knees in one spot so that my glutes can round and my spine can come up as my legs are pushing down and I stay straight. So everything we talked about, boom. And then at the top here, you can see my shoulders would be just slightly behind. This bar lines up directly over that tongue of my shoe, just like what we were talking about. In the start of my deadlift, it starts a little bit more forward. It goes back towards my body and stays over the tongue of my shoe. That allows me to stand nice, tall, and erect, nice, flat-footed, and wait for that down signal if I were a power lifter.
So there you have it, guys, the deadlift. We covered stance. We covered how to assign tension. We covered breathing. We covered bracing. We covered ways to work on getting it off the floor better, getting it around your knees better, getting it to your lockout better. We covered ways to modify so that if it's scary for you, you're coming off of an injury, whatever it is, you guys can still do deadlifts well. If you guys like content like this, please like this video. It really gets me fired up to do more content like this. Also, subscribe to this channel so that you know the next time that I'm putting out a deep dive like this or other exercise videos as well. My name is Coach Josh with GarageGangGyms.com. I'll see you guys next time.